Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from. We're so glad you're here as folks start to make their way into the Zoom room. I want to welcome you to today's Grow session entitled When Arguing Works, When It Hurts, and How to Tell the Difference with Rabbi Natan Margalit. My name is Kim Bodemer, and I'm the director of Talmud of Hebrew College, your home for adult learning. So Grow sessions are designed to be opportunities for participants to gather, reflect, observe, and wrestle with important topics relevant to our lives today through a Jewish lens. And today's session is particularly timely with the American election just a few days from now. For at least the last decade, but maybe longer than that, it seems like there's been more and more, it's been more and more difficult to be in conversation with people who may not think like we do. And it's even harder to be in relationship. So today's Grow session is an opportunity to delve into sources and consider how we can be in relationship and be in conversation. So this topic will be more thoroughly explored in a 5-session course called Conflict, Conversation, and Community, which starts a week from Thursday. And we're delighted that Natan is giving us a sneak peek of this. So Natan is the author of The Pearl and the Flame, A Journey into Jewish Wisdom and Ecological Thinking. And in this book, Rabbi Natan discovered that what makes a successful gardener effective in arguing with the weeds, fungi, and insects is the same principle that allows Jews from Abraham to the Talmud to today to be able to argue and stay in community. Rabbi Natan was ordained in Jerusalem in 1990 and earned a Ph.D. from University of California, Berkeley in 2001. He's taught at Bard College, RRC, and Hebrew College Rabbinical School, and he's currently the interim dean of faculty and chair of Rabbinic Texts Department at the Aleph Ordination Program. He is also the director of AOP's Earth-Based Judaism program and founder of the nonprofit Organic Torah. He lives in Newton with his wife, 2 sons, and a dog. So just a word about today's format before I hand it over. Rabbi Margalit asked me to share my screen when we look at the text, so I'll be doing that. I'll also put the source sheet link into the chat. And Rabbi Margalit will pause throughout the presentation to take questions and comments. I invite you to put up your hand electronically so that he can recognize you. So I'm going to stop talking and I'm going to turn it over to Rabbi Margalit.
Thank you, Kim. It's great to be here. It's great to see you all and to be learning this like a week before the election. As you said, we're in a time where I think we're all concerned about like the polarization and just the inability that we seem to have with talking across different divides that we seem to have in our society. So we'll talk about that and we can bring it up to the present. But I want to go back and look at some Jewish sources. And as Kim said, I think it really comes down to a basic principle. And I don't think it's complicated, but I want to like sort of get there by looking at some examples. And so we're going to start, as I said, like also if you have the link in your chat and you can just bring it up on your computer, then we don't need to share screen if everybody has that. If not everybody has it and can bring it up on your own, then we can share screen. But I like to see people's faces if possible. So we'll see how that works. And yeah, feel free to raise hands and to jump in because I like to have questions and dialogue. So let's start from very beginning. This is really the very beginning. So if you look on your source, the very first source is from Genesis 18, not too far from where we are nowadays, reading in the Torah. Very interesting passage when you look at it. Does everybody have it, or did we put it up on the screen? We'll see if because I can just start to go through. Okay. All right. So this is this famous incident where Abraham is arguing with God about Sodom and Gomorrah. And it starts with this very interesting little line about God is saying, seemingly God is saying this to God's self, shall I hide from Abram what I'm about to do, since Abraham is to become a great and populous nation, and all the nations of the earth are to bless themselves by him. For I have singled him out, that he may instruct his children and his posterity to keep the way of God by doing what is just and right, in order that God may bring about for Abraham what has been promised him. All this is like a prelude of what God is saying to God's self, which is pretty unusual that we get to hear what God says in God's own mind. But basically, he says, like, I'm going to share this stuff with Abraham. Now, that why is it that God wants to share this with Abraham? That's an interesting question. Then Yud He Vav He said, the outrage of Sodom and Gomorrah is so great and their sins so grave. I will go down and see whether they have acted altogether according to the outcry that has reached me. If not, I will take note. The agents went out on from there to Sodom. Now these are the angels. These are the angels now that had been visiting with Abraham, while Abraham remained standing before God. Abraham came forward and said, will you sweep away the innocent along with the guilty? What if there should be 50 innocent within the city? Will you then wipe out the place and not forgive it for the sake of the 50 innocent who are in it? Far be it from you to do such a thing, to bring death upon the innocent as well as the guilty, so that the innocent and guilty fare alike. Far be it from you. Shall not the judge of earth deal justly? And God answered, if I find within the city of Sodom 50 innocent ones, I will forgive the whole place for their sake. And Abraham spoke up, saying, here I venture to speak to my Lord. I am but dust and ashes. What if the 50 innocent should lack 5? Will you destroy the whole city for want of the 5? I will not destroy it if I find 45 there. And then it goes on. It goes on and goes down all the way down to 10, as many of us remember. But that's enough so far. So let's stop the share and let's talk about this. What do we notice about anything we notice about this conversation between Abraham and God? Anything that you know in previous years when you looked at it, or when you're looking at it now, that you notice that are interesting, or what is it about this? This definitely seems to be kind of an argument. Anything you notice about this argument? Maybe more of a negotiation, but okay, Mike. Hi, good to see you, Mike. You're muted.
Not anymore. Yeah, I think this is a unique situation where there's this bargaining going on, where, as you mentioned, this is first God speaking to himself, herself, and then wrestling really with Abraham about these issues. I don't think there's too many other examples where that happens. So it's it points to the value of human life, I guess.
Well, I didn't cut you. You skipped out a little bit in the end. What's the last thing you said?
I said it also points to the value of human life that we see in the Torah.
Yeah, the value of human life, the value of justice. You know that Abraham points out is like, you're the one I learned about justice from. Like you're not going to do justice. I thought I learned this from you.
Yeah.
And anything else? Would anybody else have any thoughts or comments? Kim, or I see
Yeah.
some. Yeah.
I'll just say really quick, I think it's interesting, the sort of mulling over what to share, because one would think that God already knows what Abraham's response is going to be. So God mulling it over of saying, well, should I share this or shouldn't I share it? I think sometimes when I think about bringing up something to others who I might anticipate what their reaction would be.
Right. Yeah, definitely. definitely, that's a really interesting thing. We'll come back to that. Barbara, and then I see the iPhone, but I don't have a name there. But so, Barbara, you're also muted. Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah, what I see is Abraham seeking clarification. So let me get this straight, God. For 50, you would forgive. What about 45? What about, just let me be sure I understand your intent.
Yeah. Yeah, very interesting. Right. It is that kind of negotiation trying to get clear. Yeah. So and I don't see your name, but oh, it says Mark. Yeah, Mark, I see.
Oh, hi. What kind of a God do you think this is? We just had the flood. He gave a rainbow, and instead of wiping out everybody, he's going to decide on a whim. What's he thinking about to destroy this? What kind of a God is this? How would you characterize him? That's my question.
Well, it seems to me that this may be a kind of a God who realizes that God has an anger problem, and therefore is proactively telling Abraham about it, because there's no real reason why God should tell Abraham about it other than to get Abraham to argue, which seems to be the point, which happens again with Moses, by the way, when God is after the golden calf and God is going to be like, wants to destroy the people, and God says to him, he says like, get out of my way, Moses, while I destroy the people. Like, yeah, wait a second. Like Moses could just hold back God? No, it's God is seems to be prompting, because God seems to want them to argue with in these situations, which we find in general with the prophets in general, is that God actually wants the prophets to stand up and argue. And it's very interesting because then Abraham argues, but I just also wanted just to note the kind of sort of politeness that Abraham does, that, is especially in the second one where he goes down to 45, is like, I'm just dust and ashes. And, and before that, it's also like, you are, it's sort of God reminding God of like, this is who you are. This is how I've learned about you. You're the author of justice. And how can it be that you're not doing this in this particular case? So let's just take that, and then let's take another example, because we want to build up a few examples and just see what the principle might be. So let's I know we could spend a whole time on this, but let's go to another famous example. This now is with the rabbis, this is from the Talmud, but it's a story about the earlier rabbis of the Mishnah, the time of Hillel and Shammai. And so it's a famous little story about the Hillel and Shammai. So Rabbi Abba said that Rabbi Shmuel said, for 3 years, Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel disagreed. These said the halacha is accordance with our opinion. And these said the halacha, that is the law, is in accordance with our opinion. Ultimately, the divine voice emerged and proclaimed, both these and those are the words of the living God. Elu ve'elu divrei Elohim chayim in Hebrew. However, the halacha is accordance with the opinion of Beit Hillel. The Gemara asks, since both these and those are the words of the living God, why were Beit Hillel privileged to have the halacha, that is the law, established according to their opinion? The reason is that they were agreeable and forbearing, showing restraint when affronted. And when they taught the halacha, they would teach both their own statement and the statement of Beit Shammai. Moreover, when they formulated their teachings and cited a dispute, they prioritized the statement of Beit Shammai to their own statement in deference to Beit Shammai. Okay, so that's our second ancient source. And let's just take a look at that. And so what do we see about this famous story? The voice comes down from heaven, Elu ve'elu divrei Elohim. Both this and this are the words of the living God, which is an interesting thing to say that we have in the Talmud. So any thoughts, any questions, thoughts, things that arise for you about this story from the Talmud? Okay.
Yeah, I'll jump in. It's reminding me, I was in a class yesterday and someone was giving an example of something and said, it's a yes and. I feel like this ancient text really speaks to that idea that there are multiple perspectives. One of them is going to be the direction you're going to go, but it doesn't diminish that there's another point of view. And so I really appreciate this text in that it reminds us that we need to look at both of those pieces.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I think it's a very striking text because basically what it's saying is that this is coming from God, is that both of these are the words that is to say, there's truth in both of these opinions. Like neither of them is completely wrong. And we have to choose one for the time being. We have to choose one because we have to go and, we have to keep moving. We can't argue forever. But they both have merit. They both have something to them. And that idea that there's more than one truth, that in other words, what the Talmud's saying is that like we actually don't have the truth with the capital T. Like we are always going to be in a place, and this is something that you see throughout the Talmud. The Talmud is like all arguments. It's literally very rarely comes up with one clear answer. They understood that since they were not prophets anymore, they're not getting a direct line to God. All they have is interpretation. And as long as we are not, having a direct line to God, we're always going to have different interpretations. And none of us has that truth with a capital T. So what are we going to do? We got to figure out how to productively argue. And so it's very interesting. One of the things that comes out of this is that like, well, why Hillel? Because Hillel seems to have a way of arguing that is actually more productive. And that seems to be by showing respect to the other side. Showing, they argued, but they showed respect to the other side as well. Mark, yeah.
So what is truth? That's the question. Is there such a thing as truth? Who's got it? Anybody?
So yeah,
Is it meaningful? Is it a meaningful concept?
Yeah, I think truth is meaningful, and we're trying to get closer to the truth. We always try to get as close to the truth as we can, and at the same time, there's a certain humility that none of us actually has the truth with a capital T. And it doesn't say that there is no such thing as truth. It just says that it's hard for us human beings to actually get there. It may be impossible for us to get there completely, but we can get closer. And there are things that are closer to the truth, and there are things that are definitely farther from the truth. But I think that as human beings, it's really, other than say 2 + 2 is 4, which is fine, but you can't really run a society on, there's not too many things you get that much clarity on. Most of our questions in society are more complicated than 2 + 2 is 4. And so we do end up trying to get as close as we can to truth and trying to use as much as our tools and our evidence as possible, but always understanding that we don't have the truth. There's another story which I didn't include, which I'll include in the class when we do in our 5-part class, which talks about that truth, God throws truth to earth and truth sprouts up to the earth. But there's a truth in heaven which we don't have access to. Our truth is the truth that sprouts from the earth. Annie.
So someone said to me around something recently, there's no right or wrong. There's always just two sides. And so I was thinking about that. And then I had true confessions. I'm started to go to the Rosendale Farmers Market on Saturday mornings. And on a little street corner across the way, they're waving the Palestinian flags. And they're like, free Palestine. And for about 2 or 3 weeks, I was like, just be cool. Don't do anything. But I just was on edge. And as I drove out and I drove past them, I'm embarrassed to say that I actually stuck a finger out the window. And then I shouted, "You're on the wrong side of history." And one of the people was very quick to shout back, "No, you're on the wrong side of history." And I thought, like, think back to Hitler. There was a right side and a wrong side. And we may debate even in this group of Jews, what's the right side around what's going on in Israel and the Middle East right now. But there are sometimes right and wrong sides. And I just feel like, I wonder what you think of that, Rabbi, because I think sometimes there are, as you said, not in the lower down decisions, but there are some places, and I'm not saying I'm right on Israel. I think I am. History will tell me out. But certainly Hitler was wrong and should have been defeated earlier. Blah blah blah. So I go on, but that is what what was on my mind.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I hear you totally. And this is a very big thing. It's very up to date. And I agree with you. I think it's not just all relative. When we say these elu ve'elu divrei Elohim chayim, it's like, it's not to say that there is no better or worse answer, that there are things which are closer to the truth and things which are farther to the truth. There are things which have evidence and there are things that have no evidence. And so I think that this idea that it's all the same and there's no truth, that I do not agree with that it's just all completely relative. But I do think that we do have that even if we say this is the better answer here, and this is clearly the better answer here, that is not to say that we have the whole truth and nothing but the truth. That is to say, or that the other side that you couldn't find, if, first of all, just in terms of well, okay, I'm not going to go too far into like strategies of arguing, but there are, I do believe that although we can't have the one truth, there are better truths and worse truths. And there are truths that have more evidence and truths which have like zero evidence. And we should choose the one with more evidence. So to that extent, we can get closer to the truth. So that is true. Stu.
Yeah, if you go back to the Sodom and Gomorrah chapter or anecdote or whatever, what I'm thinking, there's usually many more than two sides. And with the Sodom, it's 50, it's 45, it's, all the way down to 10. And the truth, the test, the whatever can be found along a spectrum with whom you are engaged. And the Sodom and Gomorrah story, the human divine interaction is woefully out of balance. With the Hillel and Shammai, they're two humans engaged. So it depends in part who your conversant is.
Right.
Or at least to me, that's
No, for sure. It really is very interesting because there definitely is like Abraham's arguing with God, and God is definitely, there's not like an equal balance there. That's for sure. So yeah, we do want to take that into account. All right, so I want to move on. I want to get into what we're really talking about, which is like what are the principles that we're looking at to say, and I want to kind of get into that. Now we've seen a couple of examples, but I want to get a little into, so now we're getting into the English more modern sources. This seems to be out of left field here. This is not a Jewish source. It's from a book that we picked up years ago called The 7 Principles of Making Marriage Work by John Gottman. These are the researchers, John Gottman and his collaborators. They did years ago, they did all these, one of the things they did was they would video couples, where they could video them like having conversations, just talking to each other for like 15 minutes. And they could say within like 97% accuracy, like which couples were going to stay together and which were not, according to their conversation styles. So this is one little clip, which I took from his book. And here's what it says. You will always have some complaints about the person you live with. But there's a world of difference between a complaint and a criticism. A complaint only addresses the specific action at which your spouse failed. A criticism is more global. It adds some negative words about your mate's character or personality. I'm really angry that you didn't sweep the kitchen floor last night. We agreed that we'd take turns doing it, is a complaint. Why are you so forgetful? I hate having to always sweep the kitchen floor when it's your turn. You just don't care, is a criticism. A complaint focuses on a specific behavior, but a criticism ups the ante. Sorry for the typos. Ups the ante by throwing in blame and general character assassination. Here's a recipe. To turn any complaint into a criticism, just add my favorite line, "What's wrong with you?" Okay, so that's a very day-to-day example of this idea that I want to work towards. And let's just go a little bit farther here, and let's take a look at a much more serious example. And again, pardon the typos. This is an example from the Warsaw Ghetto. This is an example taken from Rabbi Kalonymus Kalman Shapiro, who's the Piasetzner Rebbe, who was a Hasidic Rebbe in the time of the Warsaw Ghetto, and was continuing to do his work as a Rebbe, and he would give sermons every Shabbat, and he wrote down his sermons, and he buried his writings in this metal canister, and they were found after the war. It's really an amazing story, and he was an amazing person. So this is from a book which I highly recommend from Nehemiah Poland called The Holy Fire, where Nehemiah took selections from these sermons and edited and put a commentary. So this is what we're looking at now. And so this is talking about a Jew in the Warsaw Ghetto. And this is Rabbi Shapiro talking. We trust that you will save us and that you have not forsaken us completely, heaven forfend. But in this respect, you have forsaken us with respect to the fact that the salvation is so long in coming and the sufferings have dragged on for such a long time. How can you tolerate the humiliation of the Torah and Israel's anguish? They are being tormented and tortured just because they fulfill the Torah. So that is Rabbi Shapiro talking. And then now in a separate section, so Rabbi Shapiro is now commenting on how it is that he argues, or how he believes one should argue. Now, if the Jewish person speaks in this way as an expression of prayer and supplication, as he pours out his heart before God, that is good. But if, God forbid, he is posing questions, or even if he is not actively questioning, but in the depths of his heart, his faith, God forbid, is weakened, then God help us. And then Rabbi Poland, Nehemiah Poland, in the editorial, just has a little Poland explains, in other words, expressions of protest and challenge are quite proper when directed as part of an ongoing relationship with him. And so that is another example. Now I'm going to go to my last source, and then we can talk about all of this stuff. The last source is just from my book, where I'm talking about argument in general. And I didn't bring in the thing about the gardening. I can tell you the thing about the gardening if we have time. But I'm just talking about Jews and arguing in general. So the Jewish tolerance for argument is related to the idea of Jewish peoplehood. That very nestedness by which Judaism sees a set of concentric circles starting from the individual, the family, the Jewish people or nation, the larger human world, and the world as a whole, our arguments take place within a nested context of a larger whole. Judaism has defined itself as a people, a people who have carried a religion, a set of ideas or beliefs. But even if you don't happen to believe in that religion, set of ideas or beliefs, you're still a Jew. In terms of nestedness, you could say that a Jew's Jewish ideas and beliefs are on a more superficial level than the Jew's Jewishness. Jews are Jews in their bodies. In many ways, this embodied Jewish identity is a deeper level than thoughts. Being a member of a family or tribe creates an emotional attachment and sense of identity, which frequently is felt as deeper than thoughts or opinions, which may change many times over a lifetime. And then again, that's from my book, The Pearl and the Flame. Okay, so that was a bunch to swallow. So I don't know if I did all three of those at the same time, but one of the things that I'm getting from both the example from John Gottman and the marriage example, and also from the Holocaust example, is this idea that one can argue when one is in a container. That is to say, when there's something to contain the argument, that there's something that I may differ with you on this and this, but that difference is contained because we are both together. We're both together in something that's larger than whatever separates us. And that seems to me the big principle, is like, are we held together by something that's larger than the argument, or is the argument something that breaks us down? And I think that is the basic idea. So we see that in the case of the marriage, where we see that, like, oh, when that criticism turns over into like a critique, I mean, that complaint, pardon me, the complaint turns into a criticism, when it's like, okay, you didn't sweep the floor, that's just a complaint about a very particular kind of thing. But when you say, you are always like it, you're so lazy, you don't care, that is attacking the relationship. And that's much more dangerous, because I can understand, we can have a lot of arguments, and we're gonna have a lot of arguments about who swept the floor or who did the dishes or all those kind of things. But if those are contained within a larger whole, then they are much less dangerous. Mike, yeah, do you want to jump in?
Yes, I think that the issue, though, in our political world at this point is that we're not contained. And
Right.
I think that the difference is that within a marriage or within any other kind of close relationship, the relationship is the important piece, and these other parts of it can be worked out or ironed out usually. But in a political context, in a societal context, those boundaries don't exist. And so we don't really care that much about the relationship. If I'm on one side of a political argument and I think the other guy is total bad news, I don't really care about that relationship. So I think that's a big difference.
Well, so that is the way that our politics, unfortunately, seem to have gone now. It's not always been that way. And
Correct.
there are, I think that is exactly the issue today. I remember several years ago, I think this was back even in 2016, there was like a group of military veterans who had become like, were first, had gotten elected into Congress, and Senate and Congress. And they decided to form like some kind of like a coalition, where they took a pledge to say, like, okay, we're gonna, like, we all served in the military, we're gonna like talk to each other respectfully. It's like, and that was an example of like kind of like a vestige of something, like, because of the fact that they had this very strong sort of attachment to an American institution. And in that case, it was like the American military. They were actually able to understand their identity as something beyond just the Republican or Democrat. And it used to be, on some level, and still some places it's still, it's like one has an identity as an American, and one can remember times when there were, it's like, okay, we all have like an allegiance to the Constitution, an allegiance to this country. And you're a Democrat, I'm a Republican, you're a Democrat, whatever it is, whatever people's party was seen as nested. That was a nested identity within the larger identity, which we both agree on. And when you have that larger identity that you're nested within, that really makes all the difference, because then the arguments can remain safe and civil, even though they may become very heated. And it doesn't mean that I don't really believe with all my heart that I'm right and you're wrong, but there are going to be certain kind of limits. within that. And if you don't have that, if you think that the other one is just completely, I'm just going to completely vanquish the other person because I don't care whatsoever about them, then you're in trouble. Annie.
Yeah, I think that framework of that common interest is really important. And I just want to, I want to suggest that we all have common interest. I'm not saying everybody can go there, but we do. We are all human beings trying to survive a life on this planet. And so actually we all have common interest. And if people actually could get that, it would be a different world.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And that is the kind of thing that I think is really important. It really is important to emphasize when we're talking about climate change and all these kind of things. Yeah, of course, different countries, different nations are going to have their self-interest, but we're not going to get anywhere unless we realize like, oh, we're actually part of the same planet. And, we can't, my nation may be winning this, competition with your nation, but it doesn't matter if the planet is like going down. So all of those things are cases where you do have to understand, like, yeah, we do all have common interests. And there are a lot of cases where you can point out in political parties and things like this, where people are able to talk to people across those lines. Remember reading a few years about an article about a Democrat up in Maine, in a very red county in Maine. But it was a person, this Democratic candidate had lived there her whole life and knew the people and was just able to go up and talk to people and respectfully listen to them. And listen, and if they would like yell at her and she would say like, okay, listen, what do you have to say? And respectfully listen to them and not always win the argument, but like have a conversation. And she ended up, 2-3 times winning that red district because she was able to like have relationships that went beyond like exactly what the opinion was. Marcy, I see your hand up.
So I think that the rubric that you gave in your book about the difference between the Jewish values as an embodied identity versus accepting the beliefs and the practices is a very useful one. But if we go back to the example that Annie gave at the farmer's market, that passion comes from the embodiment rather than the beliefs and the values. And I think that, as Mike said, it's really hard to pitch your argument from the more measured, more reasonable place. And even when you're able to do that, it's rare that you are arguing with somebody who's similarly able to do that. And so the challenge for me is when I'm able to manage myself, how do I engage the other person? Like, how could she in that moment, if she had been able, and Annie, I'm sorry if I'm speaking for you, but if she had been able to have a more reasonable approach to the Palestinian protesters, how could she have assured that they would be coming from that? So how can you ever win? I don't mean how can you ever win the argument? I mean, how can you ever win the challenge of putting yourself in a place where you can have a reasonable argument?
Yeah, no,
well, let me just jump in for a second, because the week before I had a reasonable discussion with a man who supported them, and it didn't go on too long, but I listened to him respectfully. I made my opinion. We parted. There's something about one-on-one as opposed to the hordes. And just a moment, I was having a rough week. There was another way in which it was just like, I was having a rough week. I was angry. I wanted to just slap someone and they were there. But, one-on-one, it can be done.
Yeah, no. And really it does come down, and it comes down to really it's on some level, because you're right, it's on the visceral level. All this happens on the visceral, level, and we're not always just like in this very measured place in our rational mind. It's coming from our emotions. But so on some deep level, it really does have to do with like, how do I understand myself? That is to say, myself, I identify like myself and my family. On some level, my family is part of myself, and some level, when I, on some level, I understand like I'm part of the Jewish people. I understand like me and the Jewish people, we're all part of myself on some level. So can I understand like me and all humans as we're all part of myself? That is to say, when I see another human being, can I actually, even on the visceral level, say, okay, this is another human being. I understand they have needs. They have whatever trauma was in their past. They're carrying whatever, and actually have a sense of empathy. Because if I can carry even a little bit of that in, then I can lead with without the sort of the attacking. I can lead with a sense of like curiosity. And in terms of winning an argument, the best way to win an argument is actually to listen to the person and let them actually express what they want to express with a sense of real curiosity and respect. Because if you put them on the defensive, they're going to attack you right back, and nothing's going to happen. But if you say, I'm curious, what makes you feel that way, and you really listen to them, then maybe you will, maybe you won't, who knows, but at least they will feel heard. And people are a lot more likely to listen to you if they feel that you are listening to them. That's your basic principle. So in general, I think it is possible to have these kinds of arguments. Not easy, but possible when you open your sense of like, we are part of the same, we are part of the same humanity. We are part of the same country, whatever that nested unit you have. I just wanted to come back to this thing about the Jewish peoplehood, because I think one of the things that we have in this country is because this is largely a Christian country, and Christianity defines itself in a very different way than Judaism. In that sense, is that Christianity is much more of a doctrinal religion. That is to say, Christianity by definition is like, if you believe this, and this, then you can properly call yourself Christian. And it's not defined whereas in Judaism, it really isn't like that. Judaism really is like, if you were born, if you're born Jewish, or if you converted, then you're Jewish. And there are these beliefs, but the beliefs don't constitute our Judaism in the same way as some other religions. And so there really is a kind of that really is a secret within Judaism, to say that like Hillel and Shammai might really disagree, but ultimately they understand themselves to be part of the same larger whole. And that really is the key. If you see yourself as a part of a larger whole, then you're going to be able to have a much more effective and respectful kind of a dialogue. Bob, yeah.
Hi, thank you. Sorry, I was muted. I think I want to make a couple of points that actually are more referable to the comments that were made a minute ago. But we haven't really talked about what the point of this or that argument is. And for example, is the point to change the other person's mind, or is the point to reach an agreement together? I believe that if the point of the argument is to change somebody else's mind, then you have to be willing to have your own mind changed. It's not just a matter of listening to what they have to say or listening respectfully. It's also being open to the fact that you don't have a monopoly on the truth. Otherwise, you're indoctrinating. You're not likely to have a productive discussion. And then just one other comment in that regard. When I was in school, I took some classes on negotiation. And one of the points that negotiators make is that the relationship between the negotiators can be shaped, and that being generous, even giving somebody a can of Coke before you start negotiating with them, changes the dynamic of the negotiation. Kal v'chomer if you're trying to negotiate peace in the Middle East or something like that. And similarly, Rachel Fish talks about this. If there are people who are demonstrating whose goal is to kill you, you can't really have a negotiation with them. But if the point is to share ideas and to even be open to learning something, then you can.
Yeah, no, so I think that's very, very good, good comments in terms of like, I think that there's also, the possibility is that you're not going to disagree. You're just going to like say, okay, we disagree. because you're in a society, you're going to have a lot of different opinions, and in a free society, you don't actually ever expect that you're going to have everybody agreeing. That's not the point. The point is that, like, in a free society, you're going to have a lot of different opinions, and that's fine. And so I'm not always, I would, of course, like people to agree with me, and I want to convince them. But as you said, if I'm arguing in good faith, then I also want to understand that, like, I'm listening to what the other person is saying, and I can possibly learn from them. So it doesn't contradict the fact that I might really think that I'm right, but I also need to have actually the respect of the other person, or respect for the other person. And as you said, like, these little kind of things, because it does happen on an emotional level, that, like offering them a Coke or whatever it is, like, those kinds of things make a big difference, because you're shifting the emotional tone of what the context is. Kim, yeah.
So I've been mulling over the Jewish text from the Mishnah of, don't say something that cannot be heard, in hopes that it will be heard or might be heard in the end. But I guess I'm wondering, like, there are times, to Bob's point, that, going in with the right frame of mind of thinking, do I want to change this person's mind? Do I want to be open to learning more? I don't know. I mean, how do you understand that, of, like, just sometimes the argument isn't even worth it, because it doesn't matter what you're going to say, the other person isn't necessarily open to hearing a different point of view.
Yeah, I mean, there are cases, and then we're going to talk about a lot of this stuff when we get into the class, in the conflict conversation community class coming up, because there are these questions of, like, okay, well, who, sometimes you do want to exclude somebody, and sometimes you say, like, okay, this person is really just toxic to the system, and the person needs to, we can't really have a dialogue with this person, and so it's better for the whole person to, for this person to leave, or for us to not include them in this particular dialogue. Like, so anytime you have like conversations, there are going to be some, like, ground rules of what the ground rules are from that conversation. If people break those ground rules, so then they don't get to participate in the conversation. And so that's another thing. But it's also, it's not a simple kind of a question, because a lot of times you might think, like, oh, this person really, but in fact, it often is helpful to try and bring people in, even if they seem hostile at first, but because sometimes you can, by giving them respect, by being curious, you can often bring people in, but not always. And there are going to be times when it's going to be like, okay, this person needs to be excluded. And so that's the tricky question. And that's another big thing that's very up today. It's like, when do we sort of, like, cancel somebody? When do we include them? And, like, these are very big questions today. And they're very alive. Mark, yeah. You're muted.
I think you're talking about who's the authority here. Who do you trust? You're going to have an argument. Is it just going to be mano, or is it going to be somebody with a different rank, so to speak, intellectual rank, learning, a little background? And that makes all different in discussions.
Yeah, you're a little bit breaking up. I'm sorry, but all of these things are going to be taken into account. Like, we have to understand, like, all of these things, like, if there are different levels, if there people have more authority or less authority, like, how's that's going to play out in the argument? And although those things, it gets very complicated. There's no one answer to how to do this. And when you have different hierarchies of power, that makes it even more complex. And then also you bring in, like, what are the sources of authority? If we're talking about Torah, we have these texts, we can look back at these proof texts, and they have source of authority. What if somebody doesn't accept that and they have another source of authority? These are all really good questions. Mike.
Yeah, I do a fair amount of mediation in the Boston court system, and this is one of those issues that comes up a lot, is how do you deal with people who are being unreasonable or appear to be unwilling to engage in the process of talking with each other. We ask open-ended questions to try to elicit from folks what their real interests are in the issue before us. And sometimes they're willing to do that, and sometimes they're more caught up on the emotional issues involved in the issue. So that's a very important point. And if they're not willing to engage within the process, within the sort of the rules or the guidelines, then it becomes very challenging to actually deal with them. And we see that in our political system right now as well, where there's such diametrically opposed positions on various issues.
Yeah. Yeah, no, so I mean, I think for this kind of thing, there does have to be some kind of ground rules, and there does have to be a certain level of buy-in. And if there isn't a certain level of buy-in, then it becomes very difficult. Let me just, I was going to read actually, because we brought in that thing about the gardening. So let me read, because I was just really like, this was a few years ago. It was just like blew me away when I was reading one of the early books of Michael Pollan. Michael Pollan writes a lot about the nature and food. So this was a book about gardening. And I was really struck by this paragraph. So I'm just going to read this. The gardener feels he has a legitimate quarrel with nature, with her weeds and storms and plagues, her rot and death. What's more, that quarrel has produced much of value, not only in his own time here, this garden, these fruits, but over the whole course of Western history. Civilization itself, as Freud and Fraser and many others have observed, is the product of that quarrel. At the same time, the gardener appreciates that it would probably not be in his interest or in nature's to push his side of the argument too hard. Many points of contention that humankind thought it had won, DDT's victory over insects, say, or medicine's conquest of infectious disease, turned out to be Pyrrhic or illusory triumphs. Better to keep the quarrel going, the good gardener reasons, than to reach for outright victory, which is dangerous in the attempt and probably impossible anyway. So when I read this description about the gardener quarreling with nature, it just really reminded me of this Jewish idea of machloket l'shem shamayim, this idea of like an argument for the sake of heaven. Because what it really is saying is that the gardener, if the gardener really knows what they're doing, they don't want to vanquish nature because they understand that they're also a part of nature. So if they just spray a bunch of like pesticides and then it gets rid of the bugs, but then it ruins the soil, and the soil gets into, they're basically like drilling a hole in their own lifeboat. Like if you're trying to vanquish the nature, then you're really actually vanquishing yourself in the end, because they're part of the larger nested circle. And so that sort of like brings it a little bit farther out in terms of like, yes, in humanity's sort of argument with nature, as it were, when we're trying to deal with, like, we have to understand, yes, we want to manipulate nature, we want to do things, we want to build houses and roads, but we also want to understand we are part of a nested whole, we are part of the world of nature. And so therefore, we want to keep our side of the argument going, but we don't want to vanquish the other side. And I think that goes with all of our different arguments that we're talking about. It's like, can we have a productive argument where we both learn, but without vanquishing the other side, because ultimately we're part of the same larger whole. So that's just a general point that I want to leave you with. And Kim, looks like you want to jump in.
I do. I'm mindful of our time, and I want to thank you so much for a really thought-provoking hour, bringing us, some of these texts. And I want to remind folks that if you want to delve further into this, there is an opportunity, because Rabbi Margalit is going to do a 5-session course that is co-sponsored by our North Shore Clergy Group. one of my colleagues just put this in the chat if you want to check this out. We have a few other courses that are going to be starting next week if you want to look at sort of the full array. But this was really wonderful, and I'm sure much, much needed for us as we think about the conversations we'll be having with friends and family and community over the next week and weeks and months and going forward. So thank you so much. Before I let you go, I want to let this group know that you'll get a copy of the recording from this. So if you want to listen to it and share it with others. Also that our next growth session, which is our monthly free session, is on November 20th, when we'll learn with Rabbi Dr. Susan Einbinder, who's going to present memory and memory enhancement in medieval Ashkenaz. You can register for that. If you're interested in exploring travel, you can join us either in person or via Zoom for an information session about our upcoming trip to Central Europe. That's happening November 19th at 7. And we have an in-person event here at Hebrew College in collaboration with the Israel Antiquities Authority called Fortress Through the Ages, the Fortification of Jerusalem Then and Now. And Dr. Yechiel Zellinger, a senior archaeologist with the Antiquities Authority, will be joining us. So all of those events are free, and we hope that you will, you'll join us. And we'll look forward to seeing you next month.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.